The scripture lesson is found in the final chapter of the Gospel of Luke, and we have many verses to listen to, verses 13 through 35. I am reading from the Common English Bible, which is one of the newest translations from the Greek into English. On that same day, 2 disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. While they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on their journey. They were prevented from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" They stopped, their faces downcast. The one named Cleopas replied, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have taken place there over the last few days?" He said to them, "What things?" They said to him, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, because of his powerful deeds and words. He was recognized by God and all the people as a prophet. But our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. All these things happened 3 days ago, but there's more. Some women from our group have left us stunned. They went to the tomb early this morning and didn't find his body. They came to us saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who told them he is alive." Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women said. They didn't see him. Then Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all that the prophets talked about. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then he interpreted for them the things written about himself in all the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets. When they came to Emmaus, he acted as if he was going on ahead. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening, and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed, and broke it, and gave it to them. Their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. But he disappeared from their sight. They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road and when he explained the scriptures to us?" They got up right then and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, "The Lord really has risen. He appeared to Simon." Then The two disciples described what had happened along the road and how Jesus was made known to them as he broke the bread. Weren't our hearts on fire? Those were the words of the two who met Jesus on the road to Emmaus. What does that mean to you? What do you think of when you think of hearts on fire? We live in a world that tries to teach us to walk only by what we see, to believe only what we can prove, only what we can see or hear or touch or smell or test. But anyone who knows what it is to imagine things, anyone who has an imagination, knows that there are other ways to know things. When my mother was still living, she was an expert in intuition. And what that meant was that she could understand people or situations without having too much information ahead of time. She could figure people out just about the first time she met them. And it used to make me so angry. I thought, how can you do that? You just met this person. How can you say this about them? Whatever it was. But you know what? She was almost always right. And that made me mad too, you know. But somehow she had learned, or perhaps she had always known, to trust what in the West, or at least the Americans would call her gut feelings, the feelings that she had about people or situations. I remember more than one time my mother saying, "I know that I'm right, I just can't prove it." And why do I suggest that that might be like having your heart on fire? Well, maybe having your heart on fire could be compared to an image that Jesus used about keeping our lamps burning. It's possible that what these disciples were beginning to feel or to know was a sense of steady certainty, of being convicted, understanding something. I would suggest it was not a wildfire of emotion or an explosion of feeling that would pass away. I would suggest when they said, "Were our hearts on fire," it might have been like the burning bush that Moses saw in the wilderness. Remember the story. Moses saw a bush that was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. And he had to stop and look at that. And of course, thousands of years ago, that would have been very surprising. For us, we have electricity. We know what it's like for something to be lit up and not burn down anything around it. Is it possible for hearts on fire to be like that? A fire that gives light but does not destroy. I always wished that I could sense things as quickly and surely as my mother could. In fact, now that my daughter is grown up, she can do it too. And I don't think it's fair, that my mother and my daughter, but not me. I think I'm more like those two disciples on the road to Emmaus. It takes me a while to figure things out, to come to an understanding. So often it's only later on that I can look back and see, oh, God was with me in that moment. Jesus was present. There was something powerful happening just then. And you know, I believe that Luke, the gospel writer, made sure to include this story in his gospel, this story of the two who were on the road. I think he put it in to encourage someone like me, and maybe like you, to encourage someone who expects things to be a certain way and sometimes finds it hard to accept something new, some new truth. Maybe this story is here to encourage those of us who sometimes are so busy seeing things with our eyes and not with our hearts. I would suggest that those two disciples who were walking on that Easter day, that Easter evening, walking to Emmaus, I think they were probably scared to death. I think they were terrified. They were terrified and they were heartbroken. Everything was lost. All of their hope was gone. And then on top of being so brokenhearted, they had heard rumors that the tomb was empty and there'd been angels and you know, sometimes good news makes you feel even worse. They might have thought, you know, please don't hurt us with stories like that. That's too much to hope for, and it just makes the sorrow and the fear even worse. And what do I mean by that? Well, I remember something that happened some years ago when I was living in the city of Detroit in Michigan in the United States. Has anyone heard of Detroit, the city of Detroit? Yes, it's always been known for building automobiles, but it's also been known for some years as a city where there is a good amount of violence and crime, a dangerous city. It is still known as a dangerous city. And when I was living there, one of our very dear friends, who was also a member of our church, was murdered. She was stabbed to death in her apartment, and it was only a few days after Easter. They never found out who did it or why, and it was even on all the television news. And you know, Detroit was known for a long time as Murder City. A lot of murders never made the news. They were not even in the newspaper. But her story was interesting to the television newsmakers. She had been living a servant life, a true life of Christian service as a nurse on the night shift in one of the hospitals in Detroit, and it was in a dangerous part of town. And our church community we were shattered. We were heartbroken. I will never forget, because she lived very close to the church and very close to where I lived. I will never forget what it felt like to stand in the entryway of that apartment building that night with many friends and neighbors and church members standing, waiting, and watching as the police removed her body from the building. It was on a stretcher and it was covered with a sheet. It was the first time in my life that I knew what they say when they use the term gut-wrenching, where something twists inside you because it hurts. It hurts your body and your spirit. Back then, my daughter was only 3 years old. She's now grown and married, and she's a professional. So this was some time ago. And she started to hear about how Michelle, that was the name of our friend, how Michelle was going to come back to life. Now, why was she hearing this? Well, it was because the Sunday school teachers were trying to help the little children to understand that the promise of the resurrection is for everyone who loves Jesus. And these little children had loved Michelle. She had been a wonderful babysitter for a lot of them. So my daughter she was sure that Michelle was going to come back to life and she was going to be part of us again. And then a few weeks later, she started to hear about a party for someone who was getting married whose name was Michelle. And it was going to be a wedding shower, and all the church families were invited, even the little children. And my daughter was so excited. She couldn't wait to go to Michelle's wedding shower. And her father and I were confused, trying to understand, we have get-togethers at church all the time. Why is this so exciting? And then we realized she didn't know that this was a different Michelle, someone else named Michelle who was getting married. She thought that our dear friend had already been brought back to life by Jesus. It's funny, but it's very sad. It's very heartbreaking. Sometimes it is the words of hope that break our hearts. Yes, we believe in the resurrection, but we don't believe that we're going to see her in this life. Not that way. Maybe we're all too young to understand what this might mean. Even the wisest and the oldest among us is probably too young to understand this. Those two disciples had been hoping that Jesus was going to redeem Israel. We had hoped. Those are some of the saddest words in the Bible. They thought they had known what he was planning, what his teachings meant, what was going to happen. They thought they had understood. Sometimes that's very hard. And then here's something else to think about. In the translation I read, they used the word visitor, but many, many English translations say that they called him a stranger. I don't think they meant to hurt his feelings, because stranger was not a kind word. It was not a good word. It meant foreigner, someone who was not from that place, someone who did not belong. And in a way, they were right. As I said before, Jesus always was a stranger. He was always a foreigner. Even as a baby, he had been a refugee. He was a stranger in Egypt when Mary and Joseph escaped with him to that place. And as an adult, you might say that Jesus was the loneliest person who ever lived. And why? Because no one understood him, even those who tried very hard. No one understood him. But the earliest Christians began to understand a little bit. And they began to appreciate that so very much because they were also strangers in their communities and even to each other. When the Jews and the Gentiles came together, it was very difficult for them. They came from very different places and very different cultures, and they had to try to be together as the church. So when Cleopas and the other disciples said to Jesus, "Are you the only stranger?" Truth is, he was not. He was not the only stranger. They were strangers too, and they were running away from Jerusalem. It was a dangerous place to be at that time. But they finally knew who he was. And it was when they ate with him, when he broke the bread and gave it to them. And this is something that has been very important to Christians through these 2,000 years. From the very beginning, the breaking of the bread. And even the earliest people who heard the story as it was told by Luke's gospel knew and understood communion. They were having communion with Jesus. It was the Lord's Supper again, the breaking of the bread. And there are many Christian churches around the world that have the Lord's Supper every time they worship together. Jesus had told his disciples to remember him when they ate the bread and they drank the cup. He commanded them to remember him. But what if he was also saying to them, "You will remember me. You will not be able to help yourself. You will remember me when you eat together." And what if he did mean that? What if he also meant for his followers and for us to remember him, to remember that he is with us every time we eat together, every time we share any food at all? Remember him. He is present. And when we break the bread or share the rice and share the cup, we are not strangers. And neither is Jesus.